First Coast's most accurate forecast from the First Coast News Weather Team, certified by Weather Rate, sponsored by AC Designs.
Good evening, folks, and welcome in. I'm meteorologist Ross Mumal. Latest advisory out from the National Hurricane Center, and some good news for all of you. No big changes or updates to the forecast. We have three separate areas that we're watching. Of course, we have Tropical Storm Dexter, which formed on late Sunday evening. We have a secondary area of really just kind of low pressure. It's forming along that stalled stationary front now that is draped across the First Coast. So really, it's more so just an elongated area of low pressure or a surface trough. We'll see if that forms into an actual coastal low or potential tropical depression as we head towards the end of the week and into the weekend. But right now, chances remain low, only a 10% chance of development over the next 48 hours or next 2 days, and just a 40% chance over the next week. So that is for that secondary area that the National Hurricane Center is watching just off of our east coast. And then much further off to our east, just off the west coast of Africa, there is a tropical wave cluster of thunderstorms there that has been given a 50% chance of development over the next 7 days. So we're pretty much just going to go in order in the way I talked about them here. So first off, Tropical Storm Dexter. Now, I apologize for the red flashes. That is all due to the satellite imagery. So we can't do anything about that. But nonetheless, there's a decent amount of wind shear across the Mid-Atlantic and New England states. So that's kind of shearing the northern edge of this system. And then, of course, once this moves, even further and further, northward, it's going to be some cooler water. So this is really just going to be a storm up across the North Atlantic. Dexter will really just be another name added to the list here this year. Now, as we look ahead to the end of this week and into the weekend, that coastal low more than likely is really just going to increase the amount of tropical moisture that we have in place here across the southeastern quadrant of the United States, but specifically southeast Georgia and northeast Florida. And you'll notice it here. So there goes Dexter off to the northeast. By perhaps tomorrow evening, but more than likely into Thursday and Friday, we'll watch to see if any level of swirl tries to begin to develop. So any level of that counterclockwise circulation begins to develop. But it's really just going to produce an onshore flow. So northeasterly winds begin to kick in by Thursday, Friday, and even into Saturday. So that'll really do two things. To start on Thursday, northeast breeze is really just going to push most of the thunderstorm and rain chances further inland and westward out towards I-75. But then by Friday and Saturday, as we tap into a little bit more of that tropical moisture, that onshore flow is really just going to bring in waves of moisture, waves of showers and thunderstorms off and on throughout the day. So we are expecting numerous to widespread rain chances at a minimum, and then isolated to scattered thunderstorms for your Friday and Saturday. We've issued weather impact alerts for those days already. So it could be a fairly, wet and soggy end to the work week and start to your weekend here. But as of right now, we are not expecting much, if any, tropical development from that area of just elongated low pressure just off our east coast. So we talked about Dexter. We talked about that secondary area just with a 40% chance of development. And now the tropical wave, which it has a lot more probably to discuss here. It's pretty much right there in the center of your screen is where that tropical wave is currently located. So really just a disorganized area of some thunderstorms, some convection going on down there in the intertropical convergence zone. We look at a lot of different things to try to figure out, will the storm strengthen? Will it go where it will end up going, so to speak? We're still over a week away from knowing a lot of that. So we have a lot of time between now and then to try to figure out where it's going to go. One thing we'll often look at is the amount of wind shear, aloft in the atmosphere. Of course, shear breaks and tears apart tropical systems. There isn't a whole lot of wind shear across the central Atlantic or, over towards the Lesser Antilles, into the Caribbean, the Dominican, and Haiti even. So with regards to the wind shear, there is a conducive environment for something to develop. Now, you look at the upper levels with regards to the dry air and that Saharan dust, especially by this upcoming weekend. There seems to be another pretty significant plume of Saharan dust moving off of, Western Africa, just north of where that tropical wave is. So we'll have to see if that inhibits any further intensification or development from that tropical wave. It certainly could limit things, especially if it turns to the northwest, which some models are showing that it could. And then there are hints of areas even behind this tropical wave that, could become something even more past that 10 to even 14-day mark. So the forecast, it's going to be fluid. Of course, we're trying to fight against, so to speak, the people who, they'll grab a screenshot of the 18Z GFS, so the evening run of the American model that shows a strong hurricane, a potential major hurricane making landfall in the United States. That's more of just a scare tactic to try to get you to just click on those types of things. So we just want to make sure you're getting your information from a trusted news source like here at First Coast News. We're not going to try to scare you. And of course, we're not just going to put out model runs that are 10 to 14 days out that show a big storm happening. Of course, this time of the year, sea surface temperatures are so warm, and just climatologically speaking, this is when the tropics begin to get heightened. It's when we get a little bit more activity. If you've lived anywhere tropical, by the middle to latter portion of August into September, the first few weeks of October even, things can be very, very active. So from now through, mid-October, all of the models are going to show in their long-range runs, they're all going to show that, the chance for a big storm to try to develop. That's not what we're expecting right now. There's a lot that can change between now and, when those models are trying to show that. So certainly wouldn't be worried or concerned about anything as of yet. But kind of back to at least this specific tropical wave that we're taking a look at, right? We talked about the wind shear. We talked about, the drier air and Saharan dust that could limit things. And then how, it tracks and where it ends up getting steered toward can more often than not be decided by that Bermuda high. So that big area of high pressure that often sits in the, the North Atlantic can often dictate where the storm goes to. Now, we're kind of hoping that that high pressure stays just off to the east far enough that it will allow this tropical wave to recurve. But not all models are necessarily showing that. This specific model, which I believe is the European, don't quote me on that 100%, but nonetheless, this kind of keeps that high pressure area in the center part of the North Atlantic and continues to kind of just steer that low pressure system towards the northern end of the Lesser Antilles, over towards the Dominican, and potentially even up towards the Bahamas as you look ahead to next week. But each model run of multiple different models is showing different things. Sometimes they'll take it northward, and this is perhaps a better way to show it. So the European model is shown in that yellow line, and the blue line is the American model. And this is just one run of these models. We have multiple runs. There's ensemble model runs of all of these, but you'll notice they take the storm completely different directions. In this specific run, the European takes it much further, north, makes that northerly turn thanks to that more easterly track of that high pressure. In contrast, the American model takes it a little bit, further westward over towards the Bahamas, perhaps South Florida. But again, don't let this scare you in any way. This is still 10 days away. But it's just showing, there's the potential for some level of tropical activity to begin to develop out there, in the center or in the central Atlantic. But for the time being, models are just taking it every which way. This thing could just as easily go down into the Caribbean as it could, towards the Bahamas, as it could just recurve northward and not be a worry to anyone. So, this time of the year, and you'll notice it right here, during August, we start to watch for those tropical waves to start coming in from the east, and it can, often take many of these different tracks. So this is not unheard of. This is what we expect during this time of the year. But for the time being, we are not anticipating anything major or significantly impactful over at least the next 7 days. And then beyond that, as we get closer and closer, we'll be able to fine tune the forecast for you, give you a better idea of perhaps where some of these tropical waves or potential systems want to go. One thing we do know, there's plenty of energy if something does sneak into the Caribbean. That's that deep water, potential tropical energy. So there's plenty of juice to fuel some of those storms if it got down there, but we're not seeing that at this time. So some good news on that front. Next storm, though, if something would form, would be named Aaron, and after that would be Fernand and Gabrielle. So 4 storms down. We'll see if more develop here over the coming days, but for now, we are not anticipating anything to impact the first coast over at least the next 7 days. Besides that coastal low, that is really just going to increase our rain and thunderstorm chances as we head towards your Friday and Saturday. Now, before we go, I want to hand things over to meteorologist Robert Spetta. He's going to be talking with the director of the National Hurricane Center, kind of discussing some of the new tools for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season and how they're going to better be forecasting some of these tropical systems and hurricanes here this coming year.
It's the 2025 hurricane season, and the National Hurricane Center has made some changes and improvements to the way warnings are issued and disseminated. This ranging from the size of the cone to the way we collect and distribute data from inside a hurricane. I got to talk to the National Hurricane Center Director Michael Brennan about these changes. So here's a look at that full interview.
First and foremost thing on top of people's minds, as we head into the 2025 hurricane season, let's say I am somebody brand new to the Gulf Coast of Florida. What do you think are just some of the main things that they should, and I know it's a broad question, but you kind of, what are some of the main things that you think they should be ready for, prepare for, they should have in the back of their mind as we head through May and into June?
Yeah, for somebody who's moving to a hurricane-prone area the first time, you really have to start out by understanding what your risk is. Do you live in an area where you're susceptible to storm surge? That could be on the coast of Duval County. It could be along the St. Johns River. Or do you live inland and freshwater flooding from heavy rainfall is your biggest threat? Everybody's susceptible to wind impacts and tornado impacts. There's also the threat of rip currents along the coast. So it's really about understanding what the risk is where you live and developing a plan to keep you and your family safe based on that risk. So the most important thing is to find out if you live in a storm surge evacuation zone, because if you do, you could be asked by local officials to leave your home. You need to have a plan for how you're going to leave, how you're going to go, where you're going to go, how you're going to get there. And it's important to remind people that you don't always have to drive hundreds of miles or out of the state of Florida to get to a safe place in advance of a hurricane. You really just need to drive out of that storm surge evacuation zone and get to a safe place, a shelter, the home of a friend or loved one, where you can safely ride out the storm. And that might only mean driving 10 or 20 miles inland away from that storm surge threat to get to a safe place. And the other thing is, again, identify your home structural risks. Are you in a mobile home where you might be asked to leave even for a tropical storm? Are you in a flood-prone area that might need to be evacuated near a creek or a stream? And then finally, you want to think about supply kit. You want to have a disaster supply kit handy, not just for tropical storms and hurricanes, but for any other emergency. Multiple days of food, water, batteries, medicine, charging devices for your phone, and just ways that your equipment and supplies that you're going to need to be self-sufficient for several days in the aftermath of a storm where you might not have power.
And to kind of carry off of what you were just talking about, as far as getting prepared, especially if a storm is right on your doorstep. I know last year we started with the experimented cone graphics, and this year you're carrying on them again. Is there any changes from last year? And could you talk about maybe some lessons learned from last year, especially since we did have multiple storms that had impacts well inland?
Yeah, you're right. The experimental cone, this is an example of it from Milton last year. We rolled that out in August, so it was around during Helene and Milton in particular, two of the more impactful hurricanes we had, both of which made landfall in Florida. So the experimental cone shows the extent of tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings over inland areas. And you can see that in this case, almost the entire Florida peninsula was under some type of tropical storm or hurricane watch or warning. And again, showing that wind risk extends well outside the cone itself, which only tells you about where the center of the storm might go. You can see that Milton was a pretty big storm by the time it got to the Florida peninsula, brought those impacts over a wide area. So we got a lot of positive feedback about the cone, the experimental one last year. So we're continuing it this season. The only real substantial change is this area where we have a hurricane watch and a tropical storm warning in effect. We added a little more clear legend about what that means, this pink and blue hatching area. But overall, we're going to continue it this year. Have it available on hurricanes.gov, continue to gather comments and feedback and decide how to make any additional changes or whether to make it operational after the 2025 hurricane season.
And I guess to even carry and build on top of that, because another thing that I noticed in our press release here was that the cone is getting smaller. So
Yeah.
Can you just touch on, I think most people understand that means, the forecast is getting more accurate, but can you just touch on kind of what goes into the cone of air and to kind of build even more on top of that with a smaller cone? What do you think are some of the forecasts? Because I've seen this personally, the forecast challenges that go with a smaller cone of air and communicating to the broader public.
Yeah, so the cone really represents the likely path of the center of the storm. So this is the forecast for Milton here across the Gulf and across Florida and in the Western Atlantic. And these dots represent our official forecast of where we expect the center to be. And then the cone tells you where the center will be about 2/3 of the time. But it's based on our track forecast errors over the previous 5 years. So we had a pretty successful year for forecasting track in 2024. We set record low errors on average. So as those numbers come into the calculation and we drop off the earlier year, the cone is going to be about 5% smaller. So really not a huge change, probably wouldn't even be really perceptible to most people. But it does indicate that on average, track forecast errors are a lot smaller than they were, say 20 years ago. If you look back at a cone from 2005, it's going to be much, much bigger. It'd probably cover most of the state of Florida. But that does create a messaging challenge in the fact that, people need to realize that the cone just tells you where the center is going to be, likely. It doesn't tell you where the impacts are going to be. So the cone is just sort of a broad scale look at where the center of the tropical storm or hurricane is forecast or is likely to be. The watches and warnings and the other information for wind and storm surge, flooding, tornadoes tell you about the hazards. It would be really difficult, if not impossible, to indicate all that hazard information on a single graphic. So that's why we have different graphics that convey those different hazards and what those risks are.
And speaking of graphics and hazards, that really builds right into my next question, because, and this is actually a question not only for the general public, but also for me, the broadcaster. From your experience, because I could show somebody a satellite picture all day, and the big storms, people more or less ooh at it. They go, ooh, it's pretty. It doesn't translate to on the ground. So what do you think is some of the most important things as broadcasters we should be doing to help relay some of that vital information? Because the cone is great, but the Saffir-Simpson scale, but I don't think sometimes that translates to storm surge. So I'll let you take it away, because I assume where I'm kind of going with this, but it's a hard time sometimes relaying some of that vital information.
Yeah, the focus really needs to be on the hazards. And a lot of times those are covered by watches and warnings, like the wind ones you see here, the storm surge watches and warnings that highlight areas at risk for life-threatening storm surge inundation, flood watches and warnings, tornado watches and warnings. So again, because those hazards really vary in time and space during a storm, you have to focus on those hazards individually, but then also, collectively for the entire storm, for everybody, say in your viewing area, which includes people at the coast, people inland. They have different risks. So people need to understand what their risks are and really seek out the information that's related to what their risk profile is, or where they live, or where their business is located, to make sure they can get that vital information. The good news is that we can push information to people too. When we issue a storm surge or hurricane warning, that triggers a wireless emergency alert on people's cell phones based on where they're located. So if the warning is in effect for your area, you're going to get notified of that. People need to find their trusted sources of information, their broadcast meteorologist that they watch every day, who's going to be able to help guide them through the information that's coming out during a storm, which can be somewhat overwhelming at times because there is a lot of information, not just coming from the National Hurricane Center or your local National Weather Service office, but in the larger sort of media ecosystem that includes not just traditional media, but social media. So it's important for people to have those trusted sources of information, find them now so that they're not looking for them during a storm.
And I'll jump into this question here, as I heard you mention the different ways things are getting pushed and social media, and you kind of already answered it. But just kind of ask in a broader scope. You started what in 2008 or late 2000s, right at the
Yeah.
NHC. What do you
Yes.
think from your perspective as relaying that information and the public's perspective is the biggest change in the way they get the information about hurricanes, but not only that, the way they kind of process it. For example, I know evacuations used to be a lot broader back
Yeah.
then. Um,
Yes.
Now it's a lot more concise. So just from your perspective, what do you think in the last almost 20 years has been the biggest change?
Yeah, I think, well, the way people consume information is rapidly changing. You live this every day. You're in traditional media, and there's still a lot of people that, especially in an emergency like a hurricane, turn on the television and watch their local television stations to get information. So we still try to get information to them through the media pool, through the broadcast meteorology community. But we also know people consume information on their phones. Some people don't ever watch television anymore. They have apps, they have social media. So we're trying to push information out through places like live streams and other social media platforms, short videos, to, again, we're not going to get we're not going to be able to provide someone every piece of information they need about a hurricane in a 1-minute reel that we're going to post on Instagram, but we can at least raise awareness and then encourage them to go seek out information through some other channel by coming to our website, looking to their local media, connecting with their local government officials. So it's a way to try to reach people where they are and then try to point them to places where they can get more comprehensive information. So again, you're right. We can provide a lot more detail now. You go back to when I started here at NHC in 2008, we didn't have a watch or warning for storm surge. We weren't able to highlight those areas specifically at risk of life-threatening inundation. Now we can. And as you mentioned, evacuation zones have become a lot more refined. It's not just a whole big chunk of a county. Now it might just be one small piece of a barrier island or an area along the St. Johns River. So as information has gotten more precise, in some ways it's become a little more difficult for people to consume and understand. So we just have to keep making sure that we can get our voice out there with the authoritative information, and that across sort of the weather and hurricane enterprise, we amplify those sources of authoritative information, whether it's coming from us in the National Weather Service or from state and local government officials that are telling people where to evacuate and how to get ready for an event.
Oh, thank you. And one other question I had here and is almost on the line of improving technology is that nowadays we have drones coming in off of planes. We have the sail drone out there. How are these new different recon and areas of technology improving your forecast?
Yeah, a lot of it goes back to the data from the Hurricane Hunter aircraft. So, for example, you can look, here's a radar picture from one of the NOAA Hurricane Hunters flying through the storm out over the ocean where we don't have radar data. All of the ground-based radars are on land. So this is getting us data here that's giving us a view of what the storm looks like from the inside for our forecasters to look at. But this radar data, the precipitations, the structure, the wind field, is all getting into the forecast models that help us predict the track and the intensity of a storm, which then directly plays into where the storm surge is going to be, the heavy rainfall, the wind. So all the aircraft reconnaissance data that come from the Hurricane Hunters going into the models improve those track and intensity forecasts by about 10 to 20%. And that's really been a big change in recent years. And it's also helped us to improve our forecast of rapidly intensifying storms. And if you look back at, say the storms from 2024, we had Helene and Milton in particular that both underwent rapid intensification before landfall. We're out and now actually able to make some of those more aggressive intensity forecasts that we wouldn't have been able to make, say, in 2008 or 9. We just wouldn't have had the confidence to forecast a storm to strengthen by 30 or 40 miles per hour in a 24-hour period. Now we are able to issue those more aggressive forecasts, which get us into the right expectation for setting the level of what types of hazards people might have to be dealing with the storm.
Wow. Thank you, Michael. One last question. Is if there's anything I haven't may have mentioned here for you that you think that heading into the 2025 hurricane season that people absolutely should be at least aware of as we get ready for this upcoming tropical year?
Well, that it doesn't take a hurricane or a major hurricane affecting your area directly to cause substantial life-threatening impacts, especially from freshwater flooding, from heavy rainfall. Has almost nothing to do with how strong a storm is from a wind perspective. A tropical depression, a weak tropical storm can produce life-threatening flooding. And that's been the biggest killer in the United States in tropical storms and hurricanes over the last 10 or so years. It just matters how hard it rains and how long it rains in a particular location. And the other thing I'll touch on is just post-storm safety. We've seen a substantial number of post-storm fatalities in recent years in tropical storms and hurricanes, especially after major hurricanes. When you have long duration power outages, you think about the aftermath of a hurricane in Florida in August or September with no power. It's going to be really hot. People aren't going to have air conditioning. People succumb to heart attacks, other medical issues, just accidents that occur from cleaning up or driving around in an environment after a storm. We lose a lot of people to car accidents. So it's just a reminder that you don't want to just survive the storm itself. You need to also survive the aftermath, and don't come back to evacuated areas until you've been told it's safe to do so by your local officials.
And that's a good point, because we always seem like